Napoleon sat on Elba and waited for his opportunity. The opportunity presented itself as soon as Louis XVIII began to make the mistakes that would cost him the popularity of the French people. We're going to see Napoleon's greatest opponent, the Iron Duke, and then we'll see one of his other great opponents, Marshal Forwards. And then we'll come to the plains of Belgium, the Great Battle of Waterloo. Then we'll see the aftermath of the Battle of Waterloo, and finally, the legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte. With the growing dissatisfaction against Louis XVIII, Napoleon engineers his escape from Elba. He lands in France in the city of Cannes, the same place where they have the film festival. When he is there, Louis XVIII dispatched troops down to the Mediterranean coast to arrest Napoleon. And Napoleon, in one of the great moments in his career, stands before the troops, bares his breast before them, and says, "If anyone wishes to shoot his emperor, he may do so now." At that point, the soldiers took aim and then raised their rifles and went, "Viva le Napoleon!" And suddenly they all rally to Napoleon. Louis XVIII had a collective "oh shit" moment and fled to Belgium. The army now completely turns over to Napoleon. All of his generals who had mutinied now proclaim their undying fealty to the emperor. In Vienna, Talleyrand, getting the message, suddenly stands up and yells, "My emperor has returned," and walked out of the Congress. The Congress declared Napoleon an outlaw. This now began the famous 100 Days, the return of Napoleon all the way to the Battle of Waterloo. This man would be Napoleon's greatest opponent. He would be Napoleon's opponent on the peninsula in Spain and Portugal, and he would be Napoleon's opponent at the Battle of Waterloo. He was nicknamed the Iron Duke, not because of his physical prowess or ability to punch hard. It was more because he had put steel shutters on the windows of his house. His name was Sir Arthur Wellesley, the first Duke of Wellington. He also was Anglo-Irish, that is, English, born in Ireland, and was a field marshal. He was the commander of the British forces in the field. He was also the commander of the Hanoverians. That's the German state that was ruled by the kings of England. And George III is still very much the king of England at this particular time. He fought Napoleon on the peninsula in Spain and Portugal and proved to be an incredibly courageous soldier. He was a tremendous commander. He led a balanced multinational force and managed to get all sides to work with each other. He was excellent on both offense and defense. He could fight both ways and did so superbly. He was also very accommodating to locals wherever he went. This is what's called waging a clean war. That means a clean war means that the two armies go out in the field and duke it out, so to speak, and they don't burn down homes and kill civilians and all that kind of stuff. Although that does happen from time to time, it's not done intentionally. The Duke of Wellington had a great deal of admiration for Napoleon and considered him a very worthy opponent. The other opponent of Napoleon did not have much regard for Napoleon. He hated him with a passion. He was a Prussian commander named Gebhard Liebrecht von Blücher. He was nicknamed Marshal Forwards because he was always spurring his men to offensive action. Move forwards, he always said. Where Wellington was a military genius, von Blücher was a commander who excelled through hard work and determination than any sort of insight. He had a virulent hatred of Napoleon and the French. He wanted to burn Paris prior to the Treaty of Fontainebleau. Napoleon entered Paris, and the people of Paris turned out en masse to cheer their emperor. But Napoleon didn't really have time for parades. He understood that the nations allied against him would very soon come and try and defeat him. What he had to do was to keep the forces from coming together. If he could defeat them piecemeal, then he would have the success that he had had early in his career. But if the armies could merge, they had now by this point agreed that Wellington would be the overall commander. Napoleon marches into Belgium. He defeated the Dutch army and the Prussian army under Blücher at the town of Ligny in Belgium. He then turned against the Duke of Wellington at Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo was on June the 18th, 1815. The Duke understood that all he had to do was hold long enough so that the Prussian army could march over from Ligny. Napoleon sent several infantry and cavalry attacks against Wellington, who had essentially drawn his army into two boxes to hang on. Napoleon finally sent his elite Imperial Guard, and once again they fell back. And when the Prussians appeared on the ridge, Napoleon knew the battle was up, and the French began to retreat in disorder. Napoleon raced back to Paris. He was in a panic. He believed that if Blücher got to him before Wellington did, he would probably be guillotined. Napoleon then fled for the French coast to try to get on a ship, and the object was perhaps to get to Louisiana. The British had all the ports of France blockaded. At this point, Napoleon decides to give up to the British, and he surrenders himself completely to them, knowing full well that if he surrendered to the Prussians, he would have been guillotined. These are battle maps of the Battle of Ligny and the Battle of Waterloo. And so today, we always say that your moment of great defeat or great victory is your Waterloo moment. Wellington became a British national hero. He marched back into London after having dispatched Napoleon, and they were singing Rule Britannia through the streets of London. But Wellington had done more than just won a battle. Becoming a British national hero meant that he could become a politician. He used his fame and his prestige at Vienna to help essentially back up Metternich in whatever he wanted to do for the Congress. Later, Wellington would become prime minister, and he would become the chief confidant and mentor to Queen Victoria prior to her marriage to her husband Albert. Blücher was celebrated both in Britain and in Germany. Unfortunately, he died in a state of madness. And Napoleon, like I said, he had surrendered to the British. The British then decided that Europe could not have Napoleon even close to it. Now, the British did not want to kill Napoleon and make him into a martyr, so they exiled him. They exiled him to an island in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean called St. Helena. That island was surrounded by a British ship, or patrolled around by a British ship 24 hours a day. Napoleon sat on St. Helena and considered his options. He considered one last escape attempt in 1821 with the idea that he was going to go to New Orleans. He was going to go to a house on Chartres Street in Toulouse, which is now called the Napoleon House. That house originally was intended to host Napoleon when he came back to power. Unfortunately, Napoleon died due to complications from arsenic poison in 1821. The arsenic was part of the adhesive in the wallpaper, and that's what did him in. He was buried on St. Helena, but some 30 years later, he would be brought back to Paris and buried in a great sarcophagus in the Hôtel des Invalides, which was the Veterans Hospital of France at the time. This is an artist's depiction of Napoleon on St. Helena. pondering what was and what might be and what might have been. This gives you an indication of how isolated St. Helena was out in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. This is the house on St. Helena that Napoleon inhabited. He was still given the title emperor, but he was now Emperor of St. Helena. This is the room in which Napoleon finally died from arsenic poisoning at the age of 52. This is the great sarcophagus that contains the body of Napoleon at the Hotel des Invalides in Paris. I know I've said that wrong because I can't speak French all that well. You'll notice surrounding on the floor many of Napoleon's great victories, like Marengo, which is a street in New Orleans. Many wonder to this day, what is the legacy of Napoleon? Napoleon has left a great legacy on Europe and on war in general and on politics, also on literature, on music. You see here the introduction of a modern conscript army that will be the model for other nations to use. Tolstoy writes War and Peace, which features the Napoleonic invasion. Of course, I've already played for you two sections from Tchaikovsky's 1812 overture. You see how Napoleon has influenced music. In warfare, no European power would try to invade Russia again for another 130 years. And when Hitler does it in 1941, he doesn't do what Napoleon did, trying to drive a spear thrust into Russia. He tries to invade on all fronts, not again taking into account the fact that Russia is a very vast, vast country. You also see a more lasting League of National Powers in Europe coming together. In warfare, you also have the Napoleonic Charge. This is the great lightning thrust. This is what you're going to see at the Battle of Fredericksburg, at the Battle of Gettysburg, at Antietam, and in other places in the American Civil War. The Napoleonic-style charge is going to be used in World War I to great loss of life as waves upon waves of men charge machine gun nests. One of the Prussian soldiers in the Napoleonic War was Karl von Clausewitz, who wrote his famous book On War, in which he shows the tactics of warfare. It becomes the war manual of the 19th century and is still studied to this very day. As far as revolutionary politics go, remember that Napoleon is the carrying agent. His armies are the carrying agents of the revolution. Once you spread that all throughout Europe, you can't uncork the genie put the genie back into the bottle, so to speak. Conservatism remained. There's no doubt there's plenty of conservatism, there's plenty of aristocracy still in Europe. But now governments take greater care not to alienate the lower classes. They are very, very worried and anxious about nationalism and the rise of the lower classes. Napoleon and the revolution before this has unleashed forces on Europe, and it has changed things forever.